I've got a strong interest in apologetics, which is the study of the evidence that backs up the credibility of the Christian faith. And I love reading pretty much anything that has to do with apologetics. And when I was a new Christian, I was introduced to Josh Mcdowell. He's the guy who wrote the book Evidence That Demands a Verdict. That kind of put him on the map. And then he wrote lots of other books after that. And he became my hero. I loved reading his materials. And in one of his books, back in the 80s, he had a book called Answers. And it basically just answered tough questions that critics asked about the Christian faith, and he responded to them. And in the book, there was a question, is the Shroud of Turin legitimate? That's supposedly the burial cloth of Jesus. And he spent 2 chapters answering the question, and he concluded that he felt like it was not legitimate. Or it wasn't the real McCoy. And so him being my hero, I never looked into the Shroud of Turin because I thought, well, if Josh Mcdowell says it's not legitimate, why do I need to look into it? He's the expert. But then years went by, and Larry Strovel started writing his books on the case for Christ, the case for the real Jesus, the case for faith. He's got a new book out now, The Case for Heaven. And I've read all of his books, and he became my new hero because he had almost as much information or more information than Josh McDowell, but he just wrote it in such a more interesting way. And in his books, he introduced me to Gary Habermas. Dr. Gary Habermas has his Ph.D. in the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ from a secular university, the University of Michigan, which is pretty impressive. And he is one of my heroes now. I love reading about him. And so I was reading a couple years ago one of Strobel's books, and he footnoted Gary Habermas's book on the Shroud of Turin. And I was like, get out of here. Gary Habermas believes the Shroud of Turin is authentic. So that kind of got me interested. So I ended up purchasing his book, and it wound up being a 2-volume set on the Shroud of Turin. And this was last year. I read through them, and I was floored by the evidence. And so what I've realized is most Christians, like myself, know very little, or at least I knew very little, about the Shroud of Turin. And so after reading his books, I thought, man, let me put together a presentation on that. So that's the introduction here. It's a joy to be with you this morning. I hope that you enjoy this as much as I enjoy doing it. And thank you for coming out on a Saturday. So we're going to talk about the Shroud of Turin, and let me start off by just kind of telling you what it's about. If we could go to the next one. Okay, here you can see a Middle-age artwork, an oil painting, which basically shows what the Shroud of Turin is supposed to be. It's the burial cloth of Jesus. It's an expensive linen cloth that probably came originally from India. And he was wrapped in it, so the front of his body was touching this part of the cloth, the back of his body was touching this part of the cloth. And it left this imprint on the cross. Now, this is obviously a Catholic painting, so it has Catholic angels with halos and all. But I included to just show you an idea. This is what the Shroud of Turin is supposed to be. Okay, it's 4.5 yards long, 38 inches wide. It's the thickness of this undershirt that I'm wearing. And it has the image that you can see here of a man that was crucified. And an interesting trivia fact is it's the most widely examined artifact in history. Now just think about that for a second. We've got the King Tut's tomb. We've got Inca and Aztec artifacts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, all of these artifacts that have been so examined. Well, none of them have been examined as much as the Shroud of Turin. That ought to pique your interest right there, okay? So, for many years, the Shroud of Turin was considered to be fraudulent, and one of the reasons behind that is because the Catholic Church had, in the Middle Ages, all of these relics, okay? For example, they had pieces of what they called the Vera Cruz, which is supposedly pieces of the original cross of Jesus. And they claimed that they had these pieces of the cross. The problem was every major cathedral in Europe had some pieces of what they called the Vera Cruz, pieces of the cross. One historian said there were enough pieces of the cross to build Noah's Ark. So obviously they can't all be authentic. And then they had nails, the actual nails. And again, many churches in Europe had these nails. Well, obviously there were only 3, possibly 4 nails. So how could all of these churches have these nails? And the Catholic Church actually came up with a very strange doctrine that said that the relics are so holy and sacred they can actually reproduce themselves, and that's why they have so many of them. But anyway, people started wondering. They also had hay. This is hay from the actual manger. Wow. How they got that? They claim to have Mary's breast milk, Jesus' baby teeth. My favorite is this one over here. This is the finger bone of John the Baptist's finger. But not any finger, the actual finger that pointed and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." Somehow the Catholic Church got its hands on that finger, and it was one of their relics, and people paid big money to go and see these relics and genuflect and do the sign of the cross before them and supposedly take off lots of years of purgatory. So when the Shroud of Turin popped up, people automatically assumed, okay, this is just another one of those fraudulent relics, okay? But then in the 1800s, this Italian photographer, just very quickly after the camera was invented, took the first pictures of the shroud, and when he developed them, what he learned is that the image on the shroud is a negative. Now, if you remember, before we had the digital cameras, we had the old cameras where you take the pictures and then you'd send them off to some lab to get them developed, and they would hand you the pictures and an envelope with negatives in it. And you remember the negatives, you could look at them, you could kind of see a little bit, but you didn't see it clearly as much as in the picture. Well, the image on the shroud is a negative, and when he took the picture of it, the picture actually showed up clear or what have you, and that got people wondering. Wait a minute, how could it be a negative? They didn't even know about negatives in the Middle Ages. How could they have that technology? So that started some scientists looking at the shroud and investigating it to see if it was the actual burial cloth of Christ, and if the image was actually somehow related to his resurrection. And so that culminated in 1978 when a group of 40 scientists got permission from the Pope to examine the shroud for 5 days. Now, I didn't know this. I had no idea that this happened, but it did. And this was back now. They didn't have the technology that we have today, but they did have space-age technology. And with the most analytical equipment, I've seen the pictures, 2 big truckloads of equipment that they're unloading to analyze the shroud. And the cool thing about this team of scientists, 40 scientists, only 6 of them were born-again believers. The rest of them, some of them were Catholic, some of them were Jewish, some of them were atheists, some of them were agnostics, and they did not go into this thinking, oh, the shroud might be real. No, you can read about their quotes before they investigated. One of the guys said, "Give me 20 minutes with the shroud, and I'll prove it's a fraud." Okay, and this team of scientists go in and look at the shroud, and then they just become amazed, all 40 of them. So let's look at what are some of the things that they discovered about the shroud, okay? First of all, they confirmed that the image was, in fact, a negative, which doesn't necessarily prove that it's real, but it at least shows that it's interesting, if nothing else. Number 2, the image is very superficial. If you look here, you can see these are the threads magnified. Each one of these is a thread, and the thread is made up of 200 or so fibers, okay? Now, if the image had been painted on or sprayed on or some type of an applicator, the chemical, the paint or whatever, is going to be absorbed by the threads. It's going to go through several layers of thread. What they found is that it doesn't even go through an entire thread. It just goes through the top few fibers on a thread. And that left them scratching their heads. How did a artist do that? Okay. Second, the image is very detailed. Okay. Now, let me show you some of the details. First of all, let me give you a little history. The shroud was folded up for many centuries, and then in the 1500s there was a fire. It was kept in a lead box, and there was a fire, and they threw water onto it. And so what you have here, it's kind of confusing, but these are fold marks from it being folded, and this part here is where it was burnt, and they and they threw water on it. And these things right here, these are patches that some nuns from the 1500s sewed onto it to try and repair it. Okay, and that's kind of important to know that, because they've done carbon-14 testing on the shroud, and if you read on the internet, they'll say, oh, the carbon-14 dating shows that it was from the 1300s, so it's obviously fraudulent. But they did the carbon-14 on pieces of patches, which wasn't part of the original shroud, but we'll get into that later if we have time. But so if you take all of those things off and just look at the shroud, what we have is you can see the face wounds, you can see how the face was beaten, how the nose is broken, how the lip is busted open. You can see evidence of the crown of thorns. You can see whipping marks. You can see the nail prints here. You can see blood on the arm here dripping down. That's the front of the shroud. And then on the back of the shroud, you can see things like, for example, a ponytail. The victim that was crucified had a ponytail. Well, that's interesting. He had you can see the whipping marks. The scientists, there two of the people on this team were medical doctors, and they were able to count 140 wounds. Verifying that the Romans used that nine-tail whip, so with each whipping you get several wounds on it. You can see the nail marks on the feet here. You can see shoulder wounds. You can see abrasions on the knees where he had fallen, and just very, very detailed, okay? Then something that they cannot explain to this day is the image was three-dimensional, okay? And I don't completely understand this, but basically they use this image enhancer, analyzer, and it showed that the image is three-dimensional, which basically means this. If you can think of a sheet laying over a person's face, there's going to be parts of the sheet that are touching the skin, okay? Like if it was myself, my nose would be touching, maybe a little bit more than some of your noses, and then the chin would be touching, and in between this space here, it would not be touching the sheet. The sheet would hit the chin, it would hit the chest. This space here would not be touching the sheet. So the image that is produced on this shroud is three-dimensional. It includes parts of the body that never touched the sheet. They're on it. And so they wondered, how is that? And they've tried to reproduce that with using all types of experiments with mannequins and chemicals and baking it in the oven and trying to get a three-dimensional image. They have not been able to reproduce it. So scientists are left wondering how. They call it a mystery. They don't know how they did that. And obviously kind of looks like, well, it's not fraudulent, because how would somebody in the Middle Ages have that type of technology, okay? Next thing that they discovered is that it contains no pigments, no ink, no powders, no chemicals, no acids. And they looked at under heavy magnification, did all kinds of testing on it. They could find no evidence of any type of chemical or paint or acid that they used on it. And then started thinking, wow, maybe this thing is not the work of an artist, okay? Then they found that it's non-directional. The image on it is non-directional, highly magnified. They found no evidence of brush strokes or any type of an applicator. Now think about that. If it was the product of an artist, obviously there's going to be some type of an applicator that he used. Well, they found no evidence of it, okay? Then the image appears to have been burned on the shroud by a burst of radiation. It's almost like a scorch, like if you were left an iron on a piece of clothing for too long and it gets scorched. That's what they're seeing on the shroud. It's like it's burned onto the shroud, okay? And another interesting thing is that the doctors on it did medical testing on the blood. They wanted to see, is it really human blood? And they were able to determine, yes, it is human blood. They even were able to determine the blood type. It's AB blood type. And interesting enough, AB blood type is very common in the Middle East, very uncommon in the rest of the world. which kind of leads them to believe this was somebody from the Middle East, okay, that was crucified. All right? Now, what are the aspects of the shroud that indicate that it's not a fraud? Okay? Some of this is going to be repetition of some of the things that we just talked about. We're going to look at it a little more in-depthly, okay? The fact that there's first, let me say this. There's only two options. Either it's a fraud or it's legitimate. There's no in between. So any evidence that shows that it's not a fraud is obviously evidence that it's real, correct? All right, there's no in between. It's either real or it's not. And so they said that the image, the fact that it has no chemicals, no powders, no acids, and no evidence of an applicator, that certainly seems to show that it's not fraudulent. It's not the product of an artist. Number two, the nails that penetrate the wrist on the man in the shroud. You can look at a close-up here of the hand, and you can see that the nails didn't go through the palm. They went through the wrist. Okay? Now, why is that important? Well, if you look at the artwork from the Middle Ages, all of it, 100% of it, always has the nails. All the crucifixes in the Catholic churches, the nails are always in the palms of the hand. So if this was the product of an artist, he would have put the nails in the palms of the hand, not in the wrist. But medical doctors tell us today that the nails could not have gone in the hands because there's not enough bone or substance there to support the weight of an adult human on a cross. But here in the wrist, there are two bones that meet up, and a nail driven through those two bones would have enough support to support a human. So medical doctors today tell us that they were in the wrist. And then recently they found some bones of some crucified victims from the first century. And sure enough, the nails went through the wrist. So we know today historically and through archaeology and through science that the nails went through the wrist. Well, the guy on the cross, the guy in the shroud, the nails went through the wrist. Okay? Next, the thumbs are not don't show up here. The thumbs are behind the hand here, and what medical doctors tell us is that there's a nerve that goes through here, and when you hit that nerve and put a lot of pressure on it, the thumb automatically goes like that. Incidentally, let me just get sidetracked here for a second and tell you this. You remember hitting your funny bone, how much that hurts? That's a nerve that goes through here. Well, that same type of nerve goes through here. All we do is bang it, and you're in an extreme amount of pain. Imagine having a nail driven through that nerve. It was so painful that the Roman vocabulary wasn't good enough to describe it, so they actually had to invent a word. They invented the word excruciating. And that word actually means from the cross. Our Lord suffered so much when that nail went through that nerve that the Romans invented a word to describe it, excruciating. He went through an excruciating amount of pain, and it causes the thumb to go like this. And then when he died and rigor mortis set in, his thumb would have been in that hidden position. Well, the man in the shroud, his thumb is hidden. Now, and scientists began to ask, wow, how would somebody in the Middle Ages have known that and known to put the thumb behind it? It almost, again, looks like it's not the work of an artist. Then they found that the crown of thorns on the guy in the shroud, it was actually what they call a cap of thorns, like you see here, because traditionally in all the pictures and the artwork and in the crucifixions, it's always just a crown of thorns, which means he would have had wounds here. But on the shroud, the guy in the shroud actually had wounds all over his entire head, meaning he had a cap of a cap of thorns. And again, that kind of gives the idea, well, it's not fraudulent because an artist who was wanting to just trick us would have put thorns where he expected the thorns to be, or wound marks where he expected them to be. He wouldn't have put them all over the head, okay? And then the guy in the shroud had a ponytail, which is interesting because none of the artwork in the Middle Ages depict Jesus having a ponytail. But archaeologists tell us today that Palestinian Jews in the first century, the men, it was custom for them to wear a ponytail. And apparently, Jesus followed that custom and had a ponytail. Well, the guy in the shroud has a ponytail. Any one of these things, you say, big whip, but you put them all together, and it sure looks like it's pointing to something that wasn't fraudulent, okay? Then this is the one that takes the cake for me. In Hollywood, when somebody dies, they usually die with their eyes closed. But in actuality, people a lot of times die with their eyes open, and so they close the eyes, and sometimes the eyes actually open back up again. So in ancient times, they used to bury people and put coins on their eyes, and the weight of the coin would keep the eyes from opening back up again. Well, the guy in the shroud was buried with a coin on each eye, and believe it or not, the burn that somehow burned this image onto the shroud left the image of the coin. So even the coin is on the shroud, and the coin is, they've done study on it, and they found that it's a lepton. A lepton was a coin that was minted in Pilate's time, 29 AD, and if Jesus was crucified in 30 or 31, well, it works out perfect time-wise. And when they magnify it, you can see that it has the name Tiberius, which is actually, they actually spelt it wrong on the coin, but the name here has a CPA, and here you can see the CPI, and here you can see the CPI. It actually shows up under magnification, and this left the scientists, whoa, first of all, how did they know to bury him with a coin? Second, how did they get their hands on a lepton? This was back in the days before you had all this international travel. How would somebody in France get their hands on a Palestinian first century coin? And how would they have the technology to put it on there and whatever? And so it got them thinking, wow, this looks legitimate, okay? And then the shroud has pollen on it from Palestine. One of the guys on the team was a botanist, and he found evidence for 49 pollen from 49 different species of plants, and 33 of those plants grow exclusively in Palestine. And believe it or not, with the pollen, they can trace the entire history of the shroud. There's pollen on the shroud from India. There's pollen on the shroud from Palestine, and according to history, after around the end of the first century, the shroud was moved up to the city of Edessa in northern Palestine, and it was kept there for several centuries, and it has pollen from Edessa, and then it was taken to Constantinople, and there's pollen on it it stayed in Constantinople for a couple of centuries, and it's got pollen from Constantinople on it. Then when Constantinople was sacked by the Crusaders, it wound up in France, and there's pollen on it from France, and now it's kept in Turin, the city of Turin, Italy. That's why they call it the Shroud of Turin, and it has pollen from Italy on it. Now, pollen is a relatively new discovery. Back in the Middle Ages, they didn't know about pollen. So if someone was going to do this fraudulently, how would they have known to get pollen from all these different places and put it into the shroud? Okay, interesting enough. And then they also have mites on it, little bitty insects that are in the shroud, and they also come from different parts of the world, okay? So all of that seems to be evidence that this thing isn't a shroud, okay? And then the man who was crucified had dirt on his feet, and when they wrapped him in the shroud, some of that dirt got onto the shroud, and they analyzed that dirt, and it's a limestone that's found almost exclusively from Jerusalem. So again, put all these things together, and it looks like it's not fraudulent, okay? Now, let's look at some aspects of the shroud that they cannot explain. The scientific community to this day is not able to explain these aspects of the shroud. One is it appears to be an X-ray. The image on the shroud is like an X-ray, okay? What they've shown is that when Jesus was wrapped up in this linen cloth, there were several other cloths. His hands were tied, his feet were tied, and his head was tied. It had a thing around it like this to keep his mouth closed. And those are called the burial cloths. And if you look at the New Testament, two of the Gospels, Matthew and Mark, only mention the linen sheet. They mention one cloth. It's in the singular term. Luke mentions both. Luke mentions the singular cloth and the burial cloths, plural. Those burial cloths would have been the wrappings, tying them together. John mentions only the burial cloths in the plural. And so that's why Josh Mcdowell tried to argue, well, it's not legitimate because John's gospel tells us they were burial cloths, and this is just one cloth. Well, the one cloth shows evidence of the other cloths. But the cool thing is, if you think about it, if his mouth is tied shut, then you shouldn't see his teeth. Well, his teeth show up on the image in the shroud. And not just the teeth. If you look closely, you can actually see when they magnify it, they can see the roots of the teeth. And they can't explain that. And I love seeing, if you go on the internet and watch some of Gary Habermas's videos on the shroud, he's like, man, this is something that we just can't begin to understand. How could it be an X-ray? Okay? And then the fact that it's three-dimensional. And remember, the scientific community has tried all types of experiments trying to duplicate this. They're not able to duplicate it, and they're not able to explain it. How do we got this three-dimensional image? And then the blood was intact, okay? I need a volunteer for a minute. Jeremy, would you come up here a second? And just kind of hold your hand out like this, okay? Let's say that this is the body. This is the cloth. Remember, it's a long cloth, and it gets wrapped around like this. Now, if he was crucified, then there's blood all over on the body. So when they wrap him in the shroud, the blood is going to dry on the shroud. And when you unwrap it, the dried blood is going to break apart. There's going to be evidence that, well, it was unwrapped, okay? That's good, thank you. What we have found is that the blood on the shroud is intact, which means the body was never unwrapped. The blood's not broken apart on the shroud. And again, to me, that's not only evidence that it's legitimate, that's evidence that there was a resurrection, because how do you have a body being wrapped and the body not being there, but it was never unwrapped? Well, the only logical explanation for that phenomena is the resurrection, okay? And then number 4, the image on the shroud came from radiation from a corpse. And again, this is something they can't explain. And not all the scientists have converted. We're going to see that several of these scientists end up converting. They haven't all converted. They haven't all believe that this is Jesus' evidence of his resurrection, but they all say, well, this is a mystery, which is kind of a shame. Here they can't explain it, so it's a mystery. But the mystery is, well, how do we get this radiation burn from a corpse? Okay, and what Gary Habermas explains in his books is that we have hundreds, and underline that, hundreds of ancient burial cloths. Hundreds of them. Archaeologists, historians, they found them. Not one of them has a radiation burn on it. This is the only one. Well, that's interesting, okay? And you've got to ask, where did this radiation come from? A cold, dead corpse, okay? So the team of scientists, 40 of them, who examined the shroud unanimously, and that to me is a miraculous right there, that you've got 40 scientists from different walks of life, different religious beliefs, and different starting points. Some of them going in saying, oh, this thing is a hoax, and we're going to show it's a hoax. And then they unanimously conclude the shroud is not the product of an artist. They said it was a real image of a real New Testament Palestinian Jew who was crucified. Okay? That's what they concluded. All right? Now, some people would argue, well, there were hundreds of Palestinian Jews that were crucified in the first century. So how do we know that this is Jesus' burial cloth? And they have a very valid point. There were hundreds, perhaps thousands of Palestinian Jews that were crucified in the first century. So how can we say that this, of all of those, could be Jesus? Well, there were certain things about Jesus' crucifixion that were unique to Jesus alone. Okay, for example, so what does the data on the shroud tell us about the person that was crucified? Who, if we know scientifically it's a genuine burial cloth of a of a first century Palestinian Jew. What does it tell us about that Jew? Okay, well, first of all, the man in the shroud was beaten. And when they look close at it, they can see that his nose was probably broken, his lip was split open, and that was not the norm. In the first century, when they crucified somebody, that alone is an agonizing death, but they ordinarily didn't beat the person before they crucified him. Jesus was beaten, and the man in the shroud was beaten, okay? Second, the man in the shroud was whipped. This image is digitally enhanced, but it shows you all the front, the back of the body, the front of the body, all that it suffered, and 120 different wounds on it. And if we learn nothing else from this study, I want you to just appreciate, wow, what Jesus went through to have that many wounds. And again, this was not the norm. The Romans, when they crucified a victim, they didn't ordinarily whip them first. They whipped them or they crucified him. Jesus was whipped and crucified, okay? Then the man in the shroud was obviously crucified. They see the nail prints, and so they conclude, well, he was crucified. And the man in the shroud had his side pierced, which was unusual because ordinarily they broke the legs. We didn't know this at first, but only recently, in the last 100 years, we've learned that the person died on the cross by asphyxiation. And the whole purpose of the torture was you're on the cross and you're nailed, and in order to breathe, you have to push yourself up to exhale and then lower yourself to inhale. And so when the Romans wanted to speed it up, they would break your knees, break your legs, and then you're no longer able to push yourself up, and you die in just a matter of minutes because you can't breathe anymore. Okay? Well, the man in the shroud didn't have his legs broken. He had his side pierced, which is, again, exactly what the Bible says. When they came to Jesus to break his legs, they saw that he was already dead. So just to verify it, they pierced his side, and out came blood and water, and on the shroud they actually have the piercing in the side and the liquid like water coming out and blood. Wow. So again, all these things put together, there's no question that the man in the shroud was dead. We know that because rigor mortis set in. We see that in the thumbs, and we also see it in the head. The guy in the shroud, his head is like this. It's frozen in this position. And so they know that he's dead. And that's important because that blows out of the water the theory that, well, Jesus wasn't dead. He just went into a coma and then somehow revived in the cool air of the tomb. Well, if rigor mortis had set in, rigor mortis doesn't set in when you're in a coma, only when you're dead. So there's evidence that he was clearly dead, okay? And then the man in the shroud was buried in an expensive linen cloth. Okay, most crucified victims didn't receive any type of burial. They were just thrown into a common grave, an unmarked grave. That was part of the punishment. You're a criminal. But Jesus was buried, and not just buried, but he was buried with an honorable funeral in a very expensive linen cloth that actually had to be imported from India. And that goes exactly in line with what the scriptures tell us, that who buried Jesus? Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy man who would have had the money to buy this expensive linen cloth and honor his Lord, giving him a proper burial. Okay? The man did not remain wrapped in the cloth for a long period of time. We know that because there's evidence that he's dead, but there's no evidence that his body began to decompose. And that happens after just a couple of days. And so if you have no decomposure, then you've got a dead man buried in a cloth and taken out of the cloth within a couple of days. How often did that happen to the hundreds or perhaps thousands of Palestinian Jews that were crucified in the first century? Probably none of them. Probably Jesus alone. Okay, so you put all this stuff together and we're concluding, wow, the guy in this cross, the guy in the shroud is actually Jesus. Okay, now there was a burst of radiation from the corpse onto the shroud. And this, how many of the hundreds of Palestinian Jews that were crucified in the first century would have had this happen? That a burst of radiation is going to come from their corpse and all. So to me, that's interesting. And that's also just a strong argument for the resurrection, because how do you get radiation coming from a cold, dead corpse? Okay? Moving on. Let's look at the testimonies of some of these scientists, okay, who examined the shroud. Okay, this is Barry Schwartz, and I encourage you to look him up online and read about him. He was one of the Jewish scientists on this team. He was actually designated to be the photographer, and there you can see a picture of him back in 78 when he was younger, and today. He has his own web page. It's called theshroud.com, easy to remember, and most of the pictures on this presentation I got off of his web page. And interesting enough, he is still Jewish. He has not converted to Christianity, and for at least for right now, that's almost a good thing. Because if he was a Christian and he was to tell you this is the real burial cloth of Jesus, well, you would say, yeah, but you're just a closed-minded, ignorant Christian. What do you know? Well, this is not a closed-minded, ignorant Christian. This is a Jewish man, and he tells you that on his webpage. But he also says that he believes that this is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. Wow. So here we have a scientist who's not even a believer who is saying it is the burial. Now, he doesn't believe Jesus rose from the dead, and he's one of the ones who says, well, it's a mystery. How do we get this radiation burn? Well, it's a mystery. But he does believe it's the legitimate burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, okay? And that's kind of important. Kind of keep in mind that that's kind of called enemy attestation. If I was in a court of law and my mother came in to testify on my behalf and said, oh, he's a good boy, he's honorable, he's got character, that would carry very little weight. She's my mother. If I was in prison, she would say, yeah, but he's a good boy. But if my enemy, my arch enemy who can't stand me, if he was to get up and testify and say, I hate that Wozniak, but I've got to admit he's got character. Boy, that would carry a lot of weight in a court of law. Well, here we have enemy attestation. Here we've got a Jewish man who is saying this is the legitimate burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Well, Jesus of Nazareth. He wouldn't call him the Christ. Okay? Kenneth Stevenson was an engineer for the U.S. Air Force back in the 70s, and he was Catholic when he examined the shroud. And as a result, he converted and became a Pentecostal charismatic pastor. Here's a picture of him going to churches and doing presentations on the Shroud of Turin, just like we're doing today. And you've got to ask yourself, what would cause this guy to become a born-again believer as a result of examining the shroud? Well, he obviously believes the shroud is legitimate, okay? And then this is Robert Rucker. He's got a PhD in nuclear energy, and he's worked for over 38 years as in the nuclear industry. Some people say that he knows more about nuclear energy than perhaps anybody on the planet. And he says the following. So this is not some imbecile who's concluding this. This is a guy who's got his PhD in nuclear energy, and he says, I am 100% certain. In other words, there's not a doubt in my mind. I'm 100% certain that the image on the Shroud of Turin is a photograph, or more like a radiation burn of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There's a video of him on YouTube saying, wow, I don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus because of the Shroud of Turin. I believe in the resurrection of Jesus because of the Bible. The Bible says he rose from the dead. We've got 4 Gospels. We've got the epistles written early, like Corinthians was written in 54 A.D., and it mentions the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus, and his appearances. That's very early. That's just, you're talking 21 years after the event. And so he says, I believe it because of the Bible, but I also think it's cool that God provided us with a photograph, a radiation burn of the resurrection. Okay? And probably my favorite testimony of all is John German. He was the agnostic on the team, or one of the agnostics on the team. He's the guy who said, give me 20 minutes with the shroud. and I will show you that it's a fraud. And he didn't convert after the 5 days examining the shroud, but these scientists kept in touch during the years, and they continued to bounce ideas off each other and do more experiments and more investigation. And eventually, John German converted to Christianity. And in an interview, they asked him, so did you convert because of the shroud? And I love his answer. He says, no, I did not convert because of the shroud. I converted because of the man buried in the shroud. To me, that's pretty cool. Okay, so that's the Shroud of Turin, and I've got a few more minutes. This is basically where I end my presentation, but just in case you're interested in a little more in-depth study, I'd like you to be aware that they did carbon-14 dating on it. So we're going to look at that. Back in 1988, 3 scientists did carbon-14 dating on it, and they concluded that it was from 1260 to 1390. And so all these articles came out saying it's a fraud, it's a fraud. And if you go online and read about it, you're going to see this. So they're going to say, well, carbon-14 has proven it's not the real burial cloth of Jesus because it comes from the Middle Ages, okay? So I want you to be aware of that, and I just want to kind of counter that for a moment and just tell you, well, first of all, they took a piece from down here. This is where the part that they took the threads out to do the carbon-14 dating, and it turns out that that's a patch. That was a patch that was sewn on, and they found that now because they keep the threads that they used to do the carbon-14, and they went back and looked at them, and they found that it's cotton, it's not linen, and it's painted to make it look older. And so they said, oh, you know what? We didn't even use the right material. We used material from a patch, and there's patches all over the shroud that I've already talked to you about. And so apparently they used part of a patch. Then they went back and did other carbon-14 testing from parts that they thought were the actual part of the shroud, and it came back to the 1st century. Okay, so there is evidence in that, but it's not real well known, and so you're going to hear some people saying, but it's from carbon-14 has showed it's not true. But there's also, apart from carbon-14, there's a bunch of other ways to determine the age of the shroud, okay? First of all, the linen cloth goes back to the 1st century. They analyze the linen cloth, the way that it's woven together, and it's identical to other cloths like found in Masada that are sewn to be from the 1st century, okay? So it's a 1st century linen cloth. The seam that's sewn into it is from the 1st century. They've had experts looking at these things and concluding, no, this is a seam from the 1st century, okay? And then you've got the coin, the lepton coin, again, that a 1st century coin that shows up on the shroud, okay? And then you've got Christian artwork. And to me, this is interesting. These are some of the oldest paintings of Jesus. This is actually not a painting. It's a hot wax somehow or another they put together with wax. But if you look at it, you'll see several things that are in common with the image on the shroud, okay? And what they tell us is that when forensics police are looking at a picture, let's say this guy goes out and robs a bank and they get a picture of him, then what they do is they look at that picture and look at him, and if they find 20 areas of agreement, that's enough to stand in a court of law and say it was him. Okay, well, they've got over 40 here areas of or matches. You've got the big eyes, and the reason why they made the big eyes is because in the shroud he's got those coins, and they didn't know that those were coins. They just thought he had big eyes, and so all this artwork depicts Jesus with big eyes. He's got his hair parted, not right in the center, but off to the left a little bit, just like the guy in the shroud. He's got the hair going behind the neck here and over the shoulder here, just like the guy in the shroud. And so you've got these areas of agreement. This is a 6th century painting, and again, you have the same, the big owl eyes. You've got the hair parted off center. You've got the hair here going over, the hair going back. And interesting enough, on the shroud, there's if you look at it real close, you guys are going to have to, I'll try to have that. Well, you guys got it on the computer, so if you want a closer up image of this so you can see it better at home. But there's a triangle here on the forehead, and there's this scratch right here. And when these early Christian artists were doing these paintings, they just randomly put a triangle there and put the line there, just like on the shroud. So they're saying that apparently the artist who painted this picture painted it from the image on the shroud. Now, obviously, if this is a 6th century painting and it's a picture of, it's taken from the guy in the shroud, then obviously the shroud is older than that. Okay, so this is all evidence that it's older. And then you have these coins. This coin was minted in 945. And again, notice the owl eyes. Notice the way the hair is parted. Notice the way the hair is here and then the hair is here. Notice this line here, the triangle up there. This is all evidence. These are all areas of agreement which would show, okay, the shroud, this image on this coin came from the shroud. And then you've got another example here that you can't see real clearly, so you're going to have to get this at home and look at it. But again, you have the owl eyes, the hair part, the hair here, the line. Look at the line here. I mean, that shows it very clearly. That's and you know, why would they when they mint this coin put a random line there through the neck? Well, it's because it came from the shroud, and on the shroud there's a line there. Okay, what is that line? We're not real sure. It might be a watermark or something that left a line there, but either way, this is evidence. So there's plenty of evidence to show that the shroud does actually go back to the 1st century, even if carbon-14 doesn't agree with that. And of course, carbon-14 isn't always that reliable anyway. So we've got other evidences that show how old it is. Okay, let me.